Welcome to EDO Breakthrough, the podcast where we tackle economic development challenges head on. From small towns to bustling cities, every place has its own hurdles to overcome. The EDO Breakthrough podcast creates an environment of collaboration, innovation, and understanding where we can share our real-life challenges and brainstorm solutions. I'm your host, Sandy Dubé, a certified economic developer and founder of PPR Strategies. Each week, we'll be welcoming a different, brilliant, place-based mind to talk through real-life economic development challenges that have been shared with us by you, our gracious listeners. Welcome to the EDO Breakthrough podcast. I am your host, Sandy Dubé, and I am joined today with Ash Hanson. Ash, I know we've got a funny story on how we met, our little meet cute, but I'd first like to share with the listeners a little bit about you. Can you tell us a little bit about you and your story?
Awesome. Yes. Hi, Sandy. So nice to be here on this show. And yes, our sweet little meeting story, which maybe I'll wait on, but happened at the Main Street America conference. And so I have a fun intersection of being an artist that intersects with a lot of civic life and economic and community development world. So I am a rural girl at heart. I grew up in rural northern Minnesota, and I fell in love with the magical power of theater when I was in my teens. And, I say that I am a rural organizer who happened to pick up the tool of theater. And I find it to be a very useful, successful, powerful tool in terms of bringing people together and finding common ground. So, today on our conversation here, I am going to talk about how I entered into the world of community development and strengthening civic life as a more holistic approach to economic development by falling in love with the art of theater and storytelling. So I'll pause there and we can kind of go more into what that looks like, how I got to this role and the kind of origin story. But maybe, Sandy, if you want to share how we connected.
I love it.
And why you wanted to bring a theater artist onto the podcast around economic development.
I'm sure they're thinking, wow, theater and economic development, what is going on here? This is going to be so fun. But yes, Ash and I were sitting next to each other at a little coffee shop in Birmingham, Alabama, this in May of 2024. For the National Main Street America conference. And something had happened, I'm sure, in the room. I don't remember the details. You might. But all of a sudden, you and I were like making faces and having a fun conversation and laughing, and found out that we were at the same conference, but had snuck away for breakfast. And then I found out that you were not only a speaker, but preparing this song to create and share with the attendees. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that story.
Yeah, for sure. So as I mentioned, I'm a theater artist and I run a theater company, and I have for the last about 15 years called PlaceBase Productions. And we do original site-specific musicals, typically about small towns of population 20,000 or less. But I also do music because the plays that we write are musicals. And so Main Street America had reached out to me to see if I could use our process of creating a play with the Main Street America directors and write a song for Main Street. And so part of our process in PlaceBase is we do interviews and story circles over a series of weeks or months and pull out tidbits, quotes, key themes that people are sharing about their experiences in their communities, and then piece them together into a theatrical production that we share back and make sure that we're accurately representing the community as best we can in the script and the songs. So we did a similar thing for Main Street America Conference. I did interviews and story circles with a number of Main Street directors and workers and organizers and staffers from across the country. And then we also did a big survey as well. So I took a bunch of the results from the surveys and from those conversations and compiled them into a song for Main Street. And then at the conference, one of the sessions was a rehearsal. And I wasn't sure who was going to show up. I was like, who's going to come and sing with me? But we had about 20 people show up to come and learn and sing the song for Main Street as part of the closing plenary. And it was beautiful. I mean, everyone was incredibly generous and vulnerable with their stories and their passion for the work that they do in terms of celebrating community life. And a lot of folks really spoke to the power of arts and culture in and with their Main Street in terms of really celebrating and lifting up the spirit of the place. And I really feel like that is a key role for artists in community and economic development life. Is, we always talk about it as a way to help fall in love with your places and fall in love with your people, and a way to, shift some of the damaging narratives that are told about our places. And then, the other piece of this is to have fun together and to lift our spirits back up again, especially in a lot of the communities that we work in and with that have experienced a lot of disenfranchisement and extraction and many years of neglect in some ways from a more national perspective, and not being included in conversations and media and all of that. And so we really look at how our work and the work of artists overall can help to alleviate some of that heaviness that comes as a result of many years of being kind of disenfranchised and left out of the conversation.
Wow. Yeah. I think about arts and entertainment districts and some of that work. We find that work in probably slightly larger cities than you're working with. But have you had the opportunity to work with any A&E or arts and entertainment districts in your experience?
A lot of the time we are partnering with the local or regional arts councils. But in a lot of the towns that we're working with, they don't necessarily have like a public art commission or arts and entertainment district, because they're a lot smaller. But there's people who are operating in that capacity, whether or not they have that title. And I think that is the piece that's really exciting to me about being from a small town and working in and with small towns, of seeing how many people play how many different roles, right? And we are volunteering at all of the organizations and showing up for all of the community events, and those kinds of many hats that you wear in rural civic life lends itself really well then to putting on even another hat and stepping into an actual theatrical role and trying the shoes on of maybe somebody from the past, maybe somebody from the future, maybe a neighbor you haven't met before, and starting to kind of see if we can understand where each other are coming from.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that's kind of an example of how we met, and just being able to sit down and start a conversation with a stranger or somebody that you have something in common with. Ours, it happened to be that we were, sharing a cup of tea in the same environment. But I had a client a couple of years ago that I met. She had won an award, and I happened to be at the brewery, and her board was celebrating that they had just gotten this big tourism grant. It was the Louisa County Chamber of Commerce in Virginia, and Tracy Hale Clark, who is still the executive director of that organization. I walked up to her and said, "Wow, what are you celebrating?" And she started to tell me this story about how they just won this big grant and they were super excited and this is what they were going to do with it. I started asking more and more questions, and she finally said, "I'm sorry, who are you? How are you asking me these like really specific, very pointed questions about this?" And that was the
And you're like,
that was
because I'm a podcaster, this is what I do.
I said this, like, we work in this tourism economic development space. We support you and these organizations. And yes, I've always been somebody to drill down and ask all the questions. And yes, she and I consider her a dear friend and a client and a colleague. And yeah, we just renewed for another project that we're going to work with them in these next couple of months. So finding a little connection and starting that conversation. And that can happen either as a visitor or to a community, or as a resident in a community. And how can you get involved and really have that sense of place for you and family and friends, and have a place to call home. So
Absolutely. And that piece of curiosity is something that we're always leading with as best as we can, and then also hopefully cultivating in others. And so, if those moments of fear or disagreement or a lack of understanding show up, how do we lean into our curiosity and say, well, tell me more about that. And one of the things we always talk about is trying to find the thing behind the thing. So if somebody says something, there's a reason that they feel that way. And rather than just putting our guards up right away, if it's something we disagree with, of really trying to get at the thing behind the thing. I mean, if you're very angry about the way that your Main Street looks now, and then it makes you feel a certain way about, say, your local government, then maybe you ask enough questions to figure out that, oh, perhaps your parents had a store that closed down because of the big box store that came in. And so there's a real personal connection to the reason why you're upset. And then you get at the thing behind the thing and you really understand what, like, oh, I can empathize with that. And rather than it being like, oh, I won't vote anymore because I'm angry with my local government. And then just being like, well, we disagree on that. It's like, well, let's try to really understand where that's coming from. And I feel like our approach with place-based productions is we do our best. I mean, we all have our biases that we try to set aside, but we really do our best to have those conversations come from, really trying to get at the root of where people are coming from and meeting folks where they're at, knowing that we're outsiders and visitors. And even though our process lasts about a year when we work with the community, we definitely will not understand all of the nuances and complexities and history of that place by just being visitors. Though we do our best to try to really understand as a guest what is happening and how we can help shift some of those challenging narratives and lack of connection really between neighbors during our short time with the community. And it is really a gift to get to be a witness to those stories and those experiences. And I wanted to just back up a little bit because I know when earlier we were talking about, just this journey into economic development and rural communities. And I wanted to just offer, how did I get to that intersection, just to give a little bit of context. And so yes, I'm a theater artist and I studied theater in my undergrad. And then I ended up moving to the UK to work with a theater company called Cardboard Citizens that works with folks experiencing homelessness or unhoused community in the greater London area. So this girl, the small town girl from the North Country of Minnesota, flies across the pond and starts working in one of the most urban international cities in the world, and finding a lot of commonalities around lack of access to resources between the urban and rural populations, even that disparate from each other. But what I really was interested in while I was there was I was like, okay, these, sharing stories has the traditional form of theater was not something that appealed to me of like reading the old classics in the text. I love going to them. I support them. I think it's great. But I really loved, devising work with people and sharing their stories. And as I was working with Cardboard Citizens, I was like, I see so much of this work happening in urban areas, but what about the people where I come from and who's sharing the stories of ruralness on that scale? A lot of the stories about ruralness that are told, at least in the theatrical world for a long time, have been more either this like Pollyanna pastoral view of what rural is, playing like Peer Gynt's Morning Mood, or it's the other side of things where it's like this quite like desperate, hillbilly kind of version of what ruralness is. And, it is nuanced. It's all of those things and everything in between. And it's like, well, where's like the real raw rural? So during my time there, I found out about a program up in Manchester called Applied Theater at the University of Manchester. And I was like, that's it. Because what they do is allow you to apply your theater practice to a field of study that you want. And so I chose regional planning, community development, regional planning, and applying theater to that lens. And I focused on rural community development. And a lot of what I was finding was there wasn't at that time, this was in the early 2000s, there wasn't a lot of research available about the rural US community development work happening, especially with the lens of arts and culture. There were a few key, really incredible organizations around Appalachia and up in the Northeast, Double Edge Theater and Apple Shop that have been around for a like standard, like staple organizations and institutions. But I was really desperate for that kind of look at how rural communities in the United States were looking at community development and utilizing arts and culture in this way. And when I came back, I was like, this is what I want to do. I want to do arts-based community development, and I want to do it with theater, and I want to work in small towns. And how do I do it? And so I bought a book, Nonprofit for Dummies. And I was like, I'm going to start a nonprofit. That's what you do when you want to do something, and so I did. I went and like got the Nonprofit for Dummies book, opened it up, and like in the first page said, if you've never worked for a nonprofit, close this book, go get a job at a nonprofit and come back in a year, because the only way that you can understand. So that's what I did. And I got a job working at Public Art St. Paul. And I wanted to just kind of give that origin story, because at Public Art St. Paul, I was organizing the St. Paul City Artist in Residence program. And this was my first look at really understanding how artists can intersect and be like interveners in the civic realm. I went on this journey. I started my theater company. I was doing my theater company for about 7 or 8 years. And then when the 2016 election happened, and I won't get into politics, but what I will get into is the kind of mapping that was being shared around rural, and the divides that were being like really perpetuated during that time. We finally, as a country, started talking about the rural-urban divide, but what we like to call the rural-urban continuum. And we need each other, and we need to understand where we fit on this continuum and how we need to support each other as neighbors. But so at that time, I was like, what is my role here as a rural cultural worker in this moment to help kind of debunk some of the things that are being shared about rural communities, or at least lift up some of the other stories that aren't being told? So I bought a little yellow school bus, and I drove around the country, and I interviewed 127 artists in 24 states that were working in towns of 10,000 or less, to ask these kinds of questions, to be curious about what is the role of arts and cultural workers in small towns, and especially right now in this politically divisive time. From that research road trip, and it turned into this huge mobile art project. It was awesome. It's a really great experience. But from that, what I realized was that there were, of course, a lot of differences across rural America. There were some commonalities, and that the organizers as artists and arts leaders across the country that were doing this really important work of bringing a sense of belonging or connection or story sharing were extremely under-resourced and isolated and disconnected. And so Department of Public Transformation, our organization, our nonprofit, artist-led nonprofit, was born from the research of that trip. And that was in 2018. We launched Department of Public Transformation. And now we have 8 staff. We work primarily across the upper Midwest, and we're supporting rural artists and cultural workers that are stepping into leadership positions or cultivating third spaces in their communities, those that are addressing challenges through arts and cultural lens. And then we also work nationally by lifting up some of those stories through our own version of your podcast, which is called Beyond the Clock. And so, the through line over the last 20 years of being a theater artist, but then also wanting to support folks doing this kind of work, really at the intersection of arts and civic life, and looking at how arts can cultivate community and economic development. I'm just like, I'm astonished by where it's led. And also at the same time, I'm like, of course, this is where we would be.
Wow, interesting. I think we could dive in. I'm super curious about that journey and some of your big takeaways on your road trip across the country. You said a big yellow bus. I can completely, I was there. I was visualizing that with you, driving around, which is fun. I would love to hear a little bit about that, or kind of explain to our listeners, or if there's a website, a link that we could put in our show notes, something that if you have a recording, if you have a production, if you have something, you come into a community, you learn about the community, what's that final product look like? I think when we spoke, you had talked about it being a show that is put on maybe over the course of a weekend that I don't even think were recorded. I think the intention was for people to like be there and be present, and not something that was performed for YouTube later on. But I'm trying to help our listeners get a sense of that final product.
Yeah, for sure. So as I mentioned, we do the research, interviews, story circles, historical research. We write the script. And I say we, it's myself, and I usually work with another collaborator that's a playwright or a director. And then everybody else that's in or a part of the play is from the local community. We occasionally might bring in a sound engineer or a particular, puppeteer or something if we need a specific skill set for the work that we're creating together. But
do you often find that there is a hidden local that is actually a sound engineer or have those talents?
absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And all of the musicians are local and all the singers and dancers, and it's incredible. So, connecting with the local dance studio and asking the dance instructor to come and be the choreographer, is a very classic example. Or somebody always is sewing and loves costumes. And so then we find our costumer. But so we write these original large scale site specific musicals. So all of our shows are outdoors and they're mobile. They move from site to site. So in the process of writing the play, we bring it back to the community and share the script. And we're like, hey, are we accurately representing you? And then we start to talk about where we would like to stage these different scenes around town. So places of significance. And for that, we look at, activating community assets that may be celebrated and loved community assets already, or ones that have been forgotten or aren't utilized as much. So, for example, we did a production called Paddle on the Pond, and it was in this town of New London, Minnesota, of 1,200 people. And there's a mill pond in the center of town that not a lot of people were utilizing as like a kayaking and stand-up paddleboarding place at that point in time. Like it had kind of fallen to the wayside. And so we were telling the history and stories of New London, but we did it on canoes and kayaks and on the banks of the pond. And we had over 100 watercrafts on the day of the show, over 100 watercrafts on this little pond in the middle of town, paddling from scene to scene. They had a ski jump in the middle of the pond. And so we had our narrator standing with a megaphone on the ski jump in the middle of the pond. And what a joy, just these, so we trying to create these moments of awesome wonder, where you're like, wow, this is happening in my town. Look at my talented neighbors singing and dancing on the dock, that we visit, every day, or like the little community park, or this Main Street building, or wherever we end up staging one of the scenes. And we try to lift up and elevate these places and create new memories and connections to them, so that it's now when you look at the jump in the middle of the pond, you might have a different connection to it, even one that you might not have had before. And then if somebody wants to, say maybe we should get rid of the ski jump, then you might be more inclined to stand up and say, no, thank you. Like I have a connection to this place. So we look at how it can cultivate stewards of a place, and how those stories, connecting to those stories, help with that sense of place and that sense of stewardship, and exciting people to step into those leadership positions to care for their places. I mean, we really do need to, a lot of us in a lot of places need to fall back in love with our communities in order. So it's like, okay, so how does theater support economic development? And it's like, well, I like to go back a step before that. And it's like, if we want people to show up and care and spend their resources downtown, we need to go back a step further, the thing behind the thing, and say, well, how do we fall in love with our places again, or reconnect with our places or our people again, so that we want to come down and support and celebrate and, spend our resources locally, or take that risk and start that business here, or whatever it is. So we do get asked that a lot, how does the work that you're doing directly impact economic development? And I can give you examples of people in our plays that have gone on to start businesses, or begin a theater camp, or step into their artistry, or connect with other people to create a co-op, for example. Whether or not they would have done that if they were in our show, I don't know the answers to those questions. What I do know is that during the course of those productions, where we're rehearsing together, building together, dreaming together, we're seeing those connections strengthen, and we're seeing people say, God, this is a really great place to live. And these are really talented people that I live with. I love it here. And the sparkle kind of is returning to the eye. In that, one of this production we did in the town of Appleton, Minnesota, little town out in the Western Prairie, we created a Main Street of our dreams. Their Main Street had been really hard hit. And one of the things that the cast wanted to do was just imagine what it would feel like to have the main street of their dreams. And so we created these, like facades, and we created these moments of, so for a whole scene, the audience just walked slowly through the main street of their dreams, and they were being handed balloons and cupcakes and like people singing and bowling, and there's all these things like happening, and they could interact with them and participate in them. And what is the thing that's keeping us from having these things come true? Is it the stories that we're telling ourselves? Is it the lack of access to resources? Is it the disinvestment? Is it, what is it? And then so the play happens, and then there's this community conversation afterwards. And I think that's really the juice of it, where we're like, okay, so where are we going to go from here? Our casts are usually made up of between 40 and 100 people. So it's big, especially in a small town. Like a play we did in in California, in 2022, in a town of 350 people, we had about 60 people in the play and 200 people in the audience. So, 260 people of a 350 person town showing up. It's a huge percentage of people that you get to have participate in this moment. And, but then you're like, okay, we have this, like, we all just experienced this thing together. What are we going to do? How are we going to harness this energy and this momentum? And how are we going to move forward? We all just took these risks. We created something from nothing. We had fun together. We trusted each other. This is exciting. Where do we want to go from here? And in that process of just kind of telling new stories, we can start to imagine different futures together. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. I get so excited about it. I can just go on and on.
I love it. It's so good. I mean, I love the idea of activating a piece of the community that needs it, or using it to break down, areas of where people are unsure, or there are these, stereotypes of one thing or another, or to kind of break down the idea of access to transportation or education. What are some of these challenges that you can talk about in a unique way through that's your storytelling theater, musical theater production capacity. And then, once you've had a conversation about it and put something together as a team, this play, this musical, this experience, and then were all the stakeholders there, where people are they ready to activate themselves and to do something different, look at their community a little bit differently, and are invested in their community a little bit differently.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think, one of the things that we talk about with Department of Public Transformation is often arts and culture are cherry on top of the work that's already happening in community. And we like to say, it's the sugar in the ice cream. Like, it's not the cherry on top, right? It is integral to the recipe. And if we just continue to see arts and culture as a cherry on top, we're doing a disservice to our communities, I think, because if we're able to integrate artists at the table to help us think differently, be more creative about the solutions for our future, to have civic life and civic engagement be more fun, more interesting, more exciting, that is a way that artists can step in and support that kind of equitable and engaging community life. And just to talk about a little bit of the barriers hindering economic development in rural communities. As I said earlier, but just to say again, the first to name the diversity of rural. It's of course not a monolith, and each rural region is very different from the next. That being said, there's commonalities and misconceptions that still exist, and the two big words that we hear a lot and think about a lot in our work are social isolation and rural blight. And I think, these two things are really connected in this lack of third places. And why is there a lack of places to gather and ways to connect creatively in our community? And as, I've been going further and further down this road and leaning more into advocacy work as a part of our work at Department of Public Transformation, this lack of capital dollars available in disinvestments in rural area. That's the number one issue that I think I see writ large, is that there has been so much disinvestment and not a lot of resources being redistributed to rural areas. So, 18 to 20% of people live in rural areas across the country, and less than 7% of philanthropic funding, public and private, goes to rural areas. So even if we doubled all of our public and private investments, we'd only get to 14%, which still isn't enough to be equitable per capita. So part of our advocacy work is to invite philanthropists to review their portfolios, and and we say, whatever you're giving to rural, double it. We want you to double it. And there's been just gutting of rural America for its resources for centuries, and then leaving rural communities to clean up the destruction without the resources or support. So yes, there's like a lack of trust and cynicism, and this rural urban divide is perpetuated, and again, calling it the continuum and understanding that we need each other. But I think we can all agree that your health and well-being, or access to quality care, or the potential for living your dreams out in your community should not be determined by your zip code. And we need philanthropy and corporate investments to step in and repair the damages done, because it's just like a lot of these resources just can't only come from the local area. And I think we really need to think about our country's collective role in supporting supporting rural communities. And why I'm excited about having artists be a part of that conversation. I don't think it's a magic wand. I want to say that. I think we need all the tools at the table, but I do think we also do need artists at the table to help local leaders think differently about supporting new efforts and creative engagements, and, thinking creatively about civic and economic systems and redefining these identities of place, or celebrating community assets like we were talking about. There needs to be an investment in the kind of capacity needed to support these efforts, say, after the play, right? So the play is the thing, but the play is not the thing. And it's also the thing that happens after the thing that we need to really be able to support and invest in. So if we get a bunch of people really excited about their community and the ideas they have there, but there's no resources or capacity to make it happen, where we're supposed to go from there, it can get really frustrating. So again, I feel really passionate about this as well, but it's figuring out how we be more honest about what has been done to rural places and what we need to do to repair.
Mm. Wow. Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that. I agree. I think you're right, but I think that there's also this looking inward, and what can we do ourselves when living in a rural community, and what is my role as um, a leader, as a worker bee, as somebody to help kind of get things off the ground. I was recently in Oklahoma and Kansas, and talking in those communities about similar conversations, not through the theater lens, but through my lens, and encouraging people to start to do something, start the conversation, find a project that you can get behind, figure out what that is. We do a lot of strategic planning for rural communities, and figuring out how to activate in that space. But the last thing I want is a strategic plan that's going to sit on a shelf and nobody's going to touch it because it feels so daunting. So I do love your approach. Through theater, through storytelling in a unique way, to activate people and get them kind of bought in this way. But then there is this what's next? What are we doing now? So yes, I think that that's definitely the piece of it. What we're talking about is, kind of coming in as outsiders and helping to activate a community and get them thinking a little bit differently. And then, because we can't be everywhere, then leaving them charged or excited or with that work plan, using small things to make a truly a big impact. It sounds so cheesy, but I think that it is what happens in any community, regardless of size, but even the big cities, we're all still focused on our neighborhood in a big city. We're not focused on
Yes.
solving the entire city's problems. We're looking at, our block or our street, or, whatever that happens to be. So.
Yeah, and it makes me want to just mention one of the programs at Department of Public Transformation. You'd asked earlier what were some of the themes that came out of the research road trip. And our organization is founded on the 4 themes around activate, connect, nurture, and support rural arts and cultural workers really at the front lines of rural community development and connection, welcoming and belonging. One of our programs is called Activate Rural, and it's about activating places of possibility, third spaces, in formerly what some call vacant spaces, we call places of possibility. But we're currently working with 5 communities across the state of Minnesota to engage artists in activating these spaces to help create the design and move forward with the ideas of what people want to see in their community to renovate and build out these third spaces with creative classes and workshops and events. And it was the $25,000 investment in each of the communities that are as part of the selection process for these 5 communities, and 2 years of support and helping kind of launch these ideas into community life. And it has been one of the most rewarding experiences to be alongside of these 5 projects that are going through their, getting their spaces and gutting them and getting their community involved and dreaming it up together. And then, moving closer and closer. We're about a year and a half into the program, and the spaces are at different, places of opening or engagement, but they're all moving forward in this really exciting way. And, it takes a long time. It takes so much work. It takes so much capacity. And it's like a $25,000 investment in a building project, as a lot of us know. It's a lot of money, but that's not a lot of money. Like, it takes a lot more than that to make a space happen, especially when that's been potentially left alone for many years and needs a lot of work done. And these aren't capital dollars. These are programmatic dollars. But thinking about how we're working with artists in this way to get people excited and energized about a place like this in their community, I think this is something that, could be invested on a local level. When you're like, what can you do? Like, if somebody is starting an effort like this, how can you get involved to help show up? Even if it's one day of helping to, empty out the building and gut it for its next use, that means the world to the people doing these projects, right? And then, one other thing I wanted to mention, we have a Main Street building in Granite Falls, Minnesota called the Yes House. And it is one of the spaces that is still in progress renovating through a creative community design build process, artist engagements, community design build. And it is now about 2/3 complete, but we're able to host artist residencies, and we have a main floor gathering space and a rock climbing wall. And in the future, we'll have a recording studio and artist workshop space in a town of 2,800 people. And our staff at the Yes House, we support their time. We pay for their time to volunteer at other community events. And one of the things we're just trying to put into the psyche of the place is what if every business in town just paid for 1 or 2 hours, I don't know, a week, a month of our time to encourage our employees to just show up for the local committee that's starting the art festival, or the town days, or whatever it is, the rodeo. How much more civic engagement, just read a jumpstart again, that civic engagement that we lost so much of during the pandemic, or before that, with all of our reliance on digital media. And just would it cost that much to do, and what would the gain be? And so it seems like a really, we're well, if we're doing this, can we encourage others to do this and pay for a few hours or a month of your staff to show up for civic life? And so those of you that are listening that run businesses, try it out if you can and see what it does for your community. Because you really only, it's a small group of people, especially in a small town. You get 6 people on a committee, you can make anything happen. It would really, it really means a lot to the people who've been doing all the work for a long time.
That is awesome. I love it. So I think we could sit here and chit chat for hours and hours, but nobody wants to listen to a 6-hour podcast. So I'd love to know if there's anything else that you would like to add, and perhaps, Elon, draw a distinction between your place-based productions and your Department of Public Transformation. Is that the same organization?
Yeah, so PlaceBase Productions is the theater company. We've been around for about 15 years. We create the original site-specific musicals about small towns. It's my artistic practice. PlaceBaseProductions.com is the website. And there are actually, you had mentioned earlier about, we do document all of our productions. So they are all online. And you can find them on YouTube, but we also do mini documentaries of each show. So we've done now over 20 productions of varying sizes across the country. And most of them have some form of a documentation, either an album or a 4 to 8 minute mini documentary about the process. So if you Google place-based productions or put it into YouTube, you can go down a rabbit hole for sure. And then the Department of Public Transformation is a nonprofit organization led by artists and rural cultural workers. And we do programming around activating, nurturing, supporting, and connecting rural arts and cultural workers and rural communities who are curious about working with arts and cultural workers. So if you're listening and you are curious about, hey, how do we start to, work more closely with artists in the work that we're doing? We do consultancy work. We also, do a lot of speaking and coaching and things like that for folks. We have something called the Rural Civic Arts Partnership Lab, where we work with small town municipalities who are artist curious and want to see how to integrate artists into their civic life or start civic artist in residence programs in their communities. So that's publictransformation.org. And we have a weekly newsletter that's full of goodies. And I recommend jumping on our website and signing up for the newsletter and following along. See where we'll be in the region near you. Like I said, we mostly work in the upper Midwest, but we do national work as well. And we have a monthly virtual happy hour that is open to everybody called Beyond the Clock. And if you're rural curious or you're a rural dweller, and we elevate the stories of a rural cultural worker in somewhere in the U.S. and have conversations around the work that they're doing in their community and how it may connect to the work that you're doing in your community. So you're invited to join us at our virtual table, grab a drink, and join us on the second Tuesday of each month at Beyond the Clock.
Awesome. I love it. Okay. So my goal, I'm going to put it out there, is for us to work on a project together. I think that
Ooh, I love
the
it.
different lens and perspectives would be amazing. And that's the closest you're going to get me to singing is what I just did right there. So, that is it. Just
all the time though. You'll be surprised at what you end up stepping into.
just putting that out there. I'm not afraid of a microphone, but you do not want me to try to carry a tune. So my last question that I like to ask our guests is, Ash, tell us, what was your EDO breakthrough?
My EDO breakthrough. I think my EDO breakthrough is still in process. I'm looking at how we encourage investment in cultivating. I'm gonna say a word that is maybe controversial. Erotic capital in our communities, and it's something that I'm really exploring around. This idea of connection, attraction, pleasure in place. And what if our communities had a line item that we were investing every year in our erotic capital of our communities? So this is something that I'm exploring and looking at how we can, bring more play and pleasure to the places where we live.
Wow. Okay. I don't know how we can get erotic capital trending after this podcast, but we're going to try. So cool.
I've got a whole presentation about it, so we can talk about it
Okay.
more later.
Okay. Great. Great. I love it. Well, thank you so much, Ash, for joining us today. I really appreciate it. I loved hearing. You got my mind thinking on all sorts of new ways. And I thank you, our listeners, for being with us today. Until next time. The EDO Breakthrough podcast is brought to you by PPR Strategies. PPR Strategies, standing for People and Places Reimagined, is a strategic consulting firm working specifically with EDOs and other place-based organizations. We share the unique stories of communities through communication, strategic planning, marketing, media relations, and more. Visit us at pprstrategies.com and find our contact information in the show notes. I'd like to give a big thank you to you for listening. Remember, together we are unstoppable.